Okay, how's it going everyone today? Today we're going to be walking through an Alteryx workflow to develop some KPIs, some typical financial or audit KPIs that you might want to look over. Things like year to date, year over year, different types of calculations like that. We're going to start with a few different data points here inherently. We have a list of accounts. We have a monthly transaction file, so showing us some transaction IDs across accounts. And we also have a working file with departments that we want to reconcile against to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information on our accounts as well. So lots of typical finance things that we would need to do here. Inherently, the key to preparing any data set is to understand the problem and then to move through filling in the data that we might be missing. As an example here, we have our groups, but our units are missing. This is a very typical style of Excel kind of data storage where we understand, but inherently other points are missing. In SQL, you could think of this as a lead or a lag style function. But in Alteryx, we're going to use something called the multi-row tool to fill in those missing values. So before we get started here, I'm going to fade into the background and I will show you guys how we will go about solving a problem like this. Okay, so we should be seeing a blank Alteryx workflow now. And I am going to go to my preparation palette and bring in a multi-row formula. I'm going to connect my account list to this. Now my goal here is to fill in this unit field. Inherently, I want to update an existing field with that field being unit. I don't need to group by anything, but I am going to write a simple if-else expression here. So if-else logic is very powerful for solving a lot of problems. If something, then a condition, otherwise a catch-all statement. So how we're going to write this one is if the function is empty for units, then we're going to take the row -1 of unit. Else, we're just going to use unit. And again, what this is saying is if the field unit is empty, such as here, to take the row above it. It'll evaluate line by line. So what we'll notice here is when I run this workflow, all of those are going to fill in accordingly. We'll also notice that my unit field goes from being mostly yellow, 61% null, to 100% okay. That's fantastic. So now let me start preparing my monthly transaction file. Maybe I'll move these down a little bit and give myself some more room to work with. Okay, on my monthly transaction file, I notice that there's a date, but it's not stored in a date time field. It's stored in a string. So I want to convert that to a real date. Again, in Alteryx, fairly easy to do so. Out of our parse palette, I'm going to bring in a date time tool. This tool is asking me which field I would like to convert. So inherently, I would like to use transaction date. I can give it a new name, something like transaction date out, something. Doesn't really matter. And then I'm just trying to match this formatting. So I see month, day, year separated by slashes. Again, if I ran this workflow, I would now see that I get a new field, transaction date out, being stored as an actual date with my source of the date time tool. So this is much more what I'm looking for. I could now use something like a select tool to drop my old transaction date and rename this something like transaction date. Inherently, we have to drop one because they will be named the same thing. If I ran that now, we would see I just have the one transaction date. The other thing I notice in this workflow is I have charges as well as reversals. So I can see a charge and a reverse on the same day for that. Even though transaction amount is stored as a double, this amount's not negative. If I wanted to summarize something like this, I would need to negate this. So I'm going to write another little formula to convert these to negative numbers. Again, I'm going to use if-else logic, and I'm going to create a new field called corrected amount. I'd like to save that as a double. And what I'm going to say here is if the TR note is equal to RVS, which is our shorthand for reversal here, then I'm going to take the transaction amount and multiply it by -1. Fairly simple process, but we're still going to get a negative number. Else, I'm just going to use the transaction amount, and I'll make sure to end my if statement. So now we can see here, there's a reversal with a negative amount to it. And we could check all of these should be positive, and eventually when we see a reversal, it is again negative. Okay, so now I want to match my accounts to their transactions. I have accounts, and I also have GL accounts here. So I'm going to join those using a join tool. I'm going to connect one side to my L and one side to R. From the left side, I said I wanted to match on GL accounts, and on the right side, I want to use accounts. Even though they have different names, they represent the same bits of data, so they should match up quite nicely together. I'm also going to drop accounts from the right-hand side because I already have GL account, and this is just going to be a duplicate field. So now when I run that, I inherently have nothing on my left side, nothing on my right side, so all of my transactions joined up, and I have a new working file. If I were to take a look at this working file from the department, we see it's pretty close to what I'm working with here. So I said one of the things that they want to do is actually reconcile this data. Not an issue at all. Let's go about doing that. And again, go to my preparation palette here and bring in a select tool. One of the things I noticed is that a few of the data types are different between our two sheets here now. If I look at transaction ID, I see that this is stored as a string. If I look at transaction ID in here, I see it's stored as an integer. You can't join strings to integers, so inherently I'm going to change this to a v-string. Gives it a little bit more room and just allows for those two different fields to join together. I also want to standardize my transaction field. If I look in here, I see transaction IDs are not the same as I store them in here. So I need to add this T dash and a few zeros in front of my transaction ID here. I'll again do so with a formula. And to do so this time, I'm just going to update the transaction ID field. What I'm going to say is T dash to get my inherent prefix there. And then I'm going to pad left the transaction ID to 8 characters, filling those with zeros. And I just forgot a plus sign here. There we go. And what that'll give me now is exactly what I'm looking for. I use the T dash as my prefix, and then the pad left is actually evaluating how many characters were here and padding that left to 8 characters with 0. So if we had a whole bunch more transactions, this gives us lots of room to grow now. So now the idea would be to reconcile these two files together. To do so, I'm going to take everything that joined out of my one set and join that to everything of the working departments. Another cool trick here is if this squiggly line kind of bothers you, you could right click and make outgoing connections wireless. You could also highlight these two and align them vertically. It's just kind of neat little tips and tricks for you. Okay, so now I have a whole bunch of information that should be the same in this. I should have things like transaction IDs matching to transaction IDs. I should have GL accounts matching to accounts. I should have TR notes that match, whether it was a reversal or not. I also should have transaction dates that match. All of those should match for me. In terms of data, I no longer need a lot of this. I can keep transaction amount, but I probably don't need any of these. We'll keep the right transaction ID, and we don't need to rename it now. We don't need accounts. We'll keep the transaction date. We don't need the amount. There we go. So if I were to run this now, these 1,300 records join. So we know that all of these are in our new data. However, this information that was combined by us out of our account lists and our monthly transaction are not present in the working files from the department. So these 449 records maybe need to be investigated a little bit more. There's charges, there's reversals, but inherently they're not present in the working files from our departments. So we can now share this information with them and have them look into that for us, or whatever the process might be. We could even export this list if we really wanted and send it to them. So I just drag an output data tool from the in and out, and I'm going to click on this little drop down here, and maybe I want to save it as a Microsoft XLSX file. I could definitely do so, give it a name, bad charges, and I could save that. Give it a sheet, and if I run it, that file would now be created and generated. Inherently, though, I still want to calculate my year-to-date, my transformations, and my year-over-year. So to do so now, I'm going to create some other columns off the data that we're still working with. I'm going to bring in a date-time tool here and connect it to my join data. What I want to do is actually derive a month and year column out of this transaction date. So to do so, I'm actually going to convert our date time field back into a string. I'm going to pick transaction date as our date field, seeing it's our only one, and I'm going to call this month. I'm also going to use a custom function of month and year to grab the information that I'm looking for. You can also see now an error is being generated because I have create new sheet, and it's saying that this already exists. So if I wanted to overwrite this file every time I ran the workflow, I absolutely could. So this is now generating a month and a year column stored as a string for me from this transaction date. So now I could use that as a bit more of a granular grouping field. If I wanted to summarize this data, let's say, I could group by the group, unit, and this new month field. And I could summarize their corrected amount, as well as count their transaction IDs. Count distinct. We could give this a name like unit expenses, and this could be something like number of transactions. If I run that now, we'll see our data transform. So we can now see groups, units, months, how much, and how many transactions. Maybe inherently I wanted to look at the month and the year differently, as opposed to grouping by dates and doing all that work again. I could use something like a text to columns to split those fields. So I'm going to split the month on that dash or hyphen delimiter and split it into two different columns now, a month and a year. And then finally, before I do my final calculations, I'll call these a bit more appropriate names. This can be year, this can be date, this can be month. We can change these probably to integers. There we go. That looks a bit better. And there we go. Now I have a month. I have a year. I have my date and all the information about them. So let's first calculate maybe our year-to-date calculation, this top calculation. I'm going to do a pretty cool dynamic filter here to take a look at when it is so I can figure out year-to-date. I'm going to write a custom filter here, and I'm going to say on the month that it has to be less than or equal to date time month of the date time today. And what that should give me is, it looks like we're in the 6th month of the year as I record this. We shouldn't see any larger than 6. Everything that's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 will be on our false side. So if I ran this in a month's time, that would actually change and update automatically when I'm running it. Now I can go about actually taking this group, the unit, what year, and group those. And then take our unit expenses, as well as maybe the number of transactions, and summarize them. Give them a better name like unit expenses, number of transactions, and I'll add a browse tool to the end. And now I can see year to date how much they were spending. So it looks like, this team's spending a lot, but clearly they've gotten it better under control this year. This team's maybe growing, but quite a bit more expenses at this point in time. Maybe I wanted to calculate this year over year. One of the really cool things would be cross-tabbing data and actually pivoting this and orientating it a different way. So to do so with that, I'll connect my select tool just to a crosstab here. And with crosstabs, we can group by things as well as provide new column names. So what I want to do in this case is I want to group by the group, the unit, and the month. But then I want this year as a new column header and the unit expenses summarized for that year. So I'm going to take group, unit, and month, like I said. I'm going to change my column headers to be year, and I'm going to take the unit expenses and summarize those. I inherently could add things like first and lasts and totals and all kinds of great information, but that'll be enough for me on this one. And what I'm left with is a really nice view into how spending is. Now, it's very simple if I wanted to calculate year over year to bring in something like a formula tool and to calculate a new column like year over year 2020 and just do 2020 minus 2019. We'll save that as a double. And I could also add year over year 2021 as 2021 minus 2020. Add a browse tool. And what that'll do now is it'll give me all my information as well as the year over year differences. So definitely a very powerful way of of deriving this information out of data that you already have and pulling it all together in one platform to generate these. So with that, that comes to kind of the end of what I had to show you today of calculating some really basic KPIs, whether they're finance or audit based, and how you might do so and work with that data, how you might join those together, how you might pull out bits of information, summarize information, create new fields based on other fields, based positionally on other fields, and bring that to an actual tangible result. So I hope that was useful for everyone, and I hope you guys had a lot of fun. The workflow can be definitely found through Alteryx Office of Finance through your help page there, if you want to follow along and work through this workflow as well. So thanks again. All of our socials should be on the screen there. And if you have any questions, again, my name is Jordan Eckersley. You can reach me at jeckersley@newcomp.com. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.